Look at the photos of men in history. What do you notice about them in comparison to today's men? They were more masculine. They had more strength, larger jaws, thicker matted hair, and many of the attributes we attribute to a strong manhood. Today's men often appear delicate and feminized in comparison. The effeminacy of men is not a new topic at all. In fact, writings on effeminacy in society stretch back to ancient Greece. It has been said the thoroughly feminine admires the thoroughly masculine. To become more masculine is to become more magnetic to the opposite sex. Any man that is caught up in excessive release of his sexual fluids is depleting the very substances that make him a man. It is the production of these substances that commences puberty and turns the boy into a man, that grows the beard, deepens the voice, adds muscularity, virility, aggressiveness, and so on. All of the traits that come to mind when we say man are tied up in these biological substances the testes and prostate produce. And to lose them is to lose your manhood. And when a man loses his manhood, he becomes feminine. Throughout history, in many societies across the world, effeminacy was tied to perversion. The effeminate man was often seen to be morally degenerate. Up until the early 20th century, homosexuality was often seen as a result of a sexually perverted mind, a fetish, often referred to as sexual inversion. Loss of virility was often associated with this effeminization process, and this loss was often attributed to the practice of masturbation and excessive sexual indulgence. It was said that when a society at large becomes immoral and overly sensual, it undermines the foundation of society, the morality and purity of family life. This connection between effeminacy and sexual perversion, and in particular sexual excess, are not so far-fetched. Sexual excess implies the ejaculation and loss of the testicular secretions, just as effeminacy would imply the loss of the testicular secretions, namely testosterone. In that sense, they are very much interconnected, and it could be reasonably argued that excessive loss of the seminal secretion may be related to the masculinity of the man. It has been known since times of Aristotle that men who lost the ability to produce the seminal secretions became effeminate, as was seen in eunuchs throughout history. In fact, effeminacy among eunuchs was one of the most recognized and written about traits. In the past, masculinity was considered an essential trait for any man, as it fostered bravery, strength, leadership, and other traits a man needed to survive. Survival was not the same in those times as it is today. Some estimate only 50% of children survived past childhood in ancient times. Thus, the character of a man was far less a matter of preference than it was of survival. Men needed to become manly and strong in order to survive. Of course, today's world in which we live is much different. Survival is expected, and as the threat of death is off the table in most instances, perhaps the requirement of manliness is not so widespread as it once was. You can survive without being manly today. Masculinity is not a necessary requirement to survive in today's modern world. In fact, most masculine roles fall into the category of blue-collar work and are at a lower pay grade than white-collar work, which are mainly jobs that require cognitive ability above all else. Think about this. The industries of the world today reward men not for developing masculinity or strength, but for highly specialized mental knowledge in their fields. Thus, men are not incentivized to develop their manly attributes, and thus the character of man is becoming less manly. Much of man's noble traits are also a product of his masculinity. A man's moral compass is deeply intertwined with his manliness, and that manliness is dependent on testicular secretions. When his secretions are conserved and in abundance, he feels virility, confidence, courage, sexually powerful, romantic, chivalrous, loving, and so on. When a man is depleted and in a constant state of lust, he feels weak, excessively horny, feminine, apathetic, negative, submissive, nervous, guilty, and he carries a sense of discomfort around him wherever he goes. A man who becomes addicted to sexual gratification weakens his moral sense, and as a result, he becomes easily controlled by others. Sexual desire is so strong that it can override reasoning and morals, and thus actions of the man are no longer in the best interests of those he cares for, but in the interests of his sexual whims. Under all circumstances, a dandified man is ridiculous. We are accustomed to this slight weakness in a woman, and find no fault with it, so long as it is but a subordinate manifestation. The weakness of men in comparison with women lies in the great intensity of their sexual desires. Man becomes dependent upon woman, and the more, the weaker and more sensual he becomes, and this just in proportion as he becomes neuropathic. Thus may be understood the fact that in times of effeminateness and luxury, sensuality flourishes luxuriantly. Then arises the danger to society that mistresses and their dependents may rule the state and compass its ruin. The mistresses of the courts of Louis XIV and XV, the prostitutes of ancient Greece, for example. The biographies of many statesmen of ancient and modern times show that they were the instruments of women, owing to their great sensuality, which had its foundation in their neuropathic constitutions. The fact that the Catholic Church enjoins celibacy upon its priests in order to emancipate them from sensuality and preserve them entirely for the purpose of their calling is an example of discerning psychological knowledge of mankind. But it is unfortunate that the priests, living in celibacy, lose the elevating effect which love and matrimony exert upon the development of character. A man who is not in control of his lustful appetite is not in control of himself. He becomes easily manipulated, unstable, and loses his own sense of humanity. A pure mind, free from lustful thoughts, is the remedy to this. When you cut the attachment your mind has forged to sex, you become free from sexual influence. Your mind reclaims control of your sexual organs, and from this position will always place reason and intelligence over sexual gratification. A pure mind will elevate your character in the eyes of others. You will be seen as a good man, as you are embodying those traits. A sensual man is always outed by his character in much the same way. A good man is guided by reason and logic. These are his strengths. A society of men guided by reason rather than lust will no doubt prosper. Any human society is free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy sexual freedom. The evidence is that it cannot do both for more than one generation. This was the hypothesis established by J.D. Unwin in his anthropological research discussed in previous videos on this channel. Again, if we are to become a better society, we need to become good men. The traits of our manhood can only develop completely with a pure mind and chaste living. The first step to becoming a good man is cutting away our attachment to worldly pleasure, in particular lust. I believe the more a man loses his attachment to sex, the more he loses his effeminate behaviors, and the more he develops the traits of manhood. As explained, many of these traits come from his testicular secretions that semen retention conserves. The more you build these habits, the more they will go on to shape your character, your overall aura, and the way in which people perceive you. This is very important and affects your life in many ways. If you get your mind away from sensual thoughts, you stop losing your seminal secretions, and thus depletion is stopped. Vitality is restored, and you become a rejuvenated man. Good luck.